I left my husband at the gala to drag my poor student into a dirty closet. I felt like a goddess saving him from poverty, desperate to taste his struggle. But as I unbuttoned his cheap waiter's uniform, I had no idea that I wasn't the predator. I was the prey. Rain battered the panoramic windows of our penthouse, transforming the vibrant city lights below into smeared, watercolor blurs of gray and neon. From up here, the metropolis looked like a distant memory, a chaotic organism that could not touch us. Inside, the air was conditioned to a perfect, sterile stillness, a silence so heavy it felt curated, broken only by the rhythmic tapping of the rain against the glass and the occasional, delicate clink of fine porcelain against a saucer. I curled my legs underneath me in the deep, velvet armchair, wrapping my fingers around the warm ceramic mug, savoring this rare, suspended moment of Sunday morning peace. The rich, earthy aroma of freshly ground coffee mingled with the subtle, musky scent of expensive leather from the furniture, creating an olfactory cocoon of absolute security. This was the sanctuary we had built, a fortress of high culture and higher tax brackets, far removed from the grid of the streets I analyzed in my sociology lectures. I took a slow sip, letting the bitter warmth spread through my chest, feeling a profound sense of gratitude for the barriers we had erected against the world. It was a golden cage, perhaps, but one furnished with impeccable taste, where the harsh realities of inequality were merely topics for academic papers, not physical threats. Across the room, seated at the long, polished mahogany dining table, my husband Richard was immersed in the digital glow of his tablet. He was reviewing the morning summary of stock market fluctuations and architectural digests, his finger swiping with practiced, efficient motions. His face was calm, almost vacant in its concentration, wearing that familiar mask of the successful, cerebral architect that he never seemed to take off, even within the privacy of our home. We had been married for 20 years, and his profile had become as much a part of the landscape of my life as the skyline visible through the windows, steady, impressive, and occasionally cold. This was our version of intimacy, a silent, intellectual communion of two fully realized individuals who no longer needed words to validate their connection. We were the power couple of the academic and design worlds, a partnership built on mutual respect and shared ambitions rather than the messy, unpredictable fires of youthful passion. I adjusted the folds of my cashmere throw, pulling it tighter around my shoulders, and offered a soft smile in his direction. I felt a sudden, poignant surge of tenderness for him, for this stability, and for the flawless, predictable universe we inhabited. It was a life without sharp edges, safe and smooth as polished marble. Richard sensed my gaze and lifted his eyes from the screen for a brief second. He offered a light, slightly weary smile in return, an acknowledgement of our shared existence, before immediately returning his attention to the scrolling numbers. The interaction was brief, functional, and devoid of heat, yet it reassured me. Our idol seemed unbreakable, a monument to rational choices and hard work. I watched him for a moment longer, admiring the graying temples that distinguished him, before turning my attention to the sleek smartphone resting on the arm of my chair. I intended to check my lecture schedule for the coming week, a routine action to ground myself in my professional identity. My hand hovered over the dark screen, my manicured nail reflecting the ambient light. I expected nothing more than emails from the department head or reminders about tenure committee meetings. But as the screen came to life, a notification from an encrypted messaging app pulsed silently, cutting through the domestic tranquility like a jagged blade. My heart performed a traitorous, frantic leap against my ribs. It was a single message, brief and devastatingly simple. Just one word, cold. Followed by the graphic of a broken heart. The text was not signed, but I knew instantly who had sent it. The familiarity of the sender sent a jolt of electricity straight to my stomach. The word hung there, glowing in the pixelated light, an accusation and a plea all at once. I could almost feel the damp chill of the basement apartment where I imagined he lay, wrapped in thin blankets, while I sat here in climate-controlled luxury wrapped in cashmere. The contrast was nauseating. Suddenly, the expansive, beautiful living room felt incredibly small, shrinking around me like a tightening noose. The air, which had smelled so pleasantly of coffee and leather just moments ago, now felt thick and unbreathable. I looked at Richard again, but his calm, absorbed face no longer sparked tenderness. Instead, it ignited a wave of inexplicable, sticky irritation. His stability felt like stagnation, his silence felt like indifference. The perfect life we had curated suddenly felt like a suffocating performance I was desperate to escape. The vibration of the secret life I was nurturing, the raw need in that single text message, made everything around me look artificial and gray. I needed to move, to break the picture. I stood up abruptly, my movements jagged and uncoordinated compared to the usual grace I cultivated. In my haste, my hand knocked against the side table, and the half-empty cup of coffee tipped over with a dull thud. I watched in slow motion as the dark, hot liquid splashed out, violating the pristine surface of the creamy white wool rug. The stain spread aggressively, a dark, organic shape creeping across the perfect geometry of the room. It looked like a dirty wound, a festering ulcer on the flawless body of our domestic ideal. Richard looked up, startled by the noise, his brow furrowing in confusion, but I could barely see him. All I could see was that expanding darkness at my feet, a physical manifestation of the chaos I had invited into our lives, a chaos that was terrifying, destructive, and thrillingly, undeniably real. The lecture hall was a cavernous amphitheater of polished oak and tiered seating, a space designed to amplify the voice of authority and shrink the individual into a passive receptacle of knowledge. Before I even reached the podium, the air was vibrating with the low-frequency hum of 300 students, a sound that reminded me of a disturbed beehive. I paused for a moment at the side entrance, smoothing the lapels of my blazer, allowing the noise to wash over me. I loved this specific moment of anticipation, the seconds before I stepped into the light and commanded the room. It was a rush of pure, unadulterated power that my domestic life, with its quiet comforts and predictable rhythms, had long ceased to provide. Here, I was not just a wife or a woman approaching middle age, I was the gatekeeper of truth, the architect of young minds, and the center of their universe for the next 90 minutes. I walked to the heavy wooden lectern, placing my notes down with a deliberate, audible thud that cut through the chatter. The effect was instantaneous. The murmur of conversation died down, replaced by the rustle of notebooks opening and the expectant silence of the audience. I looked out at the sea of faces, a mosaic of privilege and ambition. Most of them were the children of senators, CEOs, and diplomats, young people who had never known a day of true want in their lives. They were here to earn a credit, to check a box on their way to law school or investment banking. The irony of the subject matter I was about to teach them was never lost on me. In fact, it fueled my performance. I adjusted the microphone, took a deep breath, and began to speak, my voice projecting clearly to the very last row. Today's topic was systemic oppression and the illusion of social elevators in late capitalism. It was my favorite subject, the one where I felt most alive, most righteous. I moved away from the safety of the podium, pacing the stage as I spoke, using my hands to carve shapes in the air. I spoke of redlining, of the prison industrial complex, of the glass ceilings that were reinforced with steel for those born in the wrong zip code. I watched their faces as I spoke, looking for a spark of recognition or guilt. I wanted to unsettle them, to make them feel the weight of their inheritance. My voice rose and fell in a carefully practiced cadence, ringing with a righteous indignation that felt genuine in the moment, a performance of empathy that I had perfected over 2 decades of academia. I painted vivid pictures of poverty and struggle, using words as precision instruments to dissect the American dream until it lay in pieces on the floor. I felt a flush of heat rise in my cheeks, a physical manifestation of my intellectual passion. To them, this was theory; to the people I described, it was blood and bone. I was the bridge between these two worlds, the translator of suffering for the elite. It was a noble calling, or so I told myself as I scanned the room, making brief eye contact with students who quickly looked away, uncomfortable with the intensity of my gaze. I challenged them to check their privilege, to understand that their starting line was someone else's finish line. The energy in the room shifted, becoming heavier, more charged. Yet, despite the hundreds of eyes fixed on me, my performance was directed at an audience of one. In the third row, slumped low in his seat as if trying to disappear into the wood, sat Marcus. He was a visual dissonance in this room of pastel polos and designer sweaters. He wore a faded, charcoal gray hoodie that had seen too many wash cycles, the fabric thinning at the elbows. The hood was pulled up, casting a shadow over the upper half of his face, but I knew he was watching me. I could feel the weight of his gaze, dark and intense, tracking my movements across the stage. He did not take notes, he did not fidget with a laptop. He simply sat there, a statue of stillness amidst the frantic scribbling of his peers. Marcus was my project, my cause, my living proof that the theories I espoused held water. I had singled him out from the first week of the semester, intrigued by his silence and the raw, unpolished intelligence that occasionally flashed in his eyes. He was a scholarship student, a transfer from a community college in a neighborhood that most of my other students only saw on the evening news. To me, he was a rough diamond, buried under layers of societal neglect and hardened by a life I could only imagine. I believed it was my duty, my moral obligation, to excavate his potential, to chip away the rough edges and reveal the brilliance I was certain lay beneath. I saw myself as his savior, the benevolent hand reaching down to pull him up from the mire. As I continued the lecture, discussing the concept of cultural capital, I found myself drifting closer to his side of the stage. I spoke about how language, dress, and mannerisms serve as gatekeepers to the elite, barring entry to those who haven't mastered the code. I wanted him to know that I understood, that I saw the barriers he faced, and that I was the one person in this institution who could help him dismantle them. I saw his jaw tighten slightly, the only sign that he was listening. It was a small reaction, but it sent a thrill of satisfaction through me. I was reaching him. I was breaking through the armor he wore to survive in this alien environment. The clock on the back wall ticked relentlessly towards the hour. I wrapped up my final point with a flourishing rhetorical question that left the room in a thoughtful silence, followed immediately by the sharp, jarring ring of the bell. The spell was broken. The hive buzzed back to life instantly as 300 students simultaneously slammed books shut, zipped bags, and began the noisy exodus towards the exits. The sound was deafening, a chaotic symphony of shuffling feet and rising chatter. I stood at the podium, gathering my notes with slow, deliberate movements, my heart rate beginning to accelerate in anticipation. I did not look up, but I was acutely aware of the thinning crowd. Slowly, the noise receded, flowing out into the corridors like water draining from a basin. The heavy double doors swung shut again and again, swallowing the students until the room felt vast and empty. The silence that followed was heavy, laden with the dust of chalk and the lingering energy of the lecture. Only then did I lift my head. As I expected, he was still there. Marcus had not moved. He sat alone in the vast emptiness of the tiered seating, a solitary island in a sea of vacant desks. He waited until the last student had disappeared before he slowly uncoiled his long limbs and stood up. He began to descend the stairs towards the stage. His movements were loose, languid, possessing a kind of prowling grace that was entirely different from the hurried, efficient walks of the other students. He moved like someone who owned his own time, who refused to be rushed by the artificial schedules of the institution. The sound of his sneakers squeaking faintly on the linoleum steps echoed in the quiet hall. I remained frozen behind the safety of the lectern, gripping the edges of the wood until my knuckles turned white. Every step he took towards me ratcheted up the tension in the room, tightening the invisible wire that connected us. When he finally reached the bottom of the amphitheater and stepped into the well where I stood, the air between us seemed to thicken, becoming viscous and hard to breathe. He stopped just a foot away from the lectern, invading my personal space in a way that was both threatening and exhilarating. Up close, the reality of him hit me with a sensory force. He smelled of the damp autumn rain that was soaking the city outside, mixed with the acrid, earthy scent of cheap tobacco and the faint musk of a young man's sweat. It was a gritty, authentic smell, a sharp contrast to the sterile, expensive colognes of my husband and my colleagues. He did not speak immediately. He just looked at me, his dark eyes unreadable under the shadow of his hood. The silence stretched, balancing precariously between awkwardness and intimacy. Then, without a word, he reached into the pocket of his hoodie and pulled out a folded, slightly crumpled collection of papers. It was his essay, due today. He extended his hand towards me. The paper was not the crisp, laser-printed document I required from my students, it looked handled, lived in, perhaps written on a kitchen table in a crowded apartment or on a late-night bus. This imperfection only endeared him to me more. It was an artifact of his struggle. I reached out to take it. As I grasped the papers, my fingers brushed against his. The contact was brief, lasting perhaps a second longer than was necessary or appropriate, but the effect was electric. A jolt of cold shock raced up my arm and settled deep in my spine, causing a shiver that I hoped he didn't see. His skin was warm, rougher than mine, and the contrast sent a confusing signal to my brain. It wasn't just the touch of a student handing in work, it felt like a transaction of a different nature. In that fleeting contact, there was a question, a challenge, and a silent promise of something forbidden. I pulled my hand back, clutching the essay to my chest as if it were a precious manuscript. My heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I looked up at him, trying to regain my composure, trying to re-establish the hierarchy of professor and student. But the dynamic had shifted. The air was charged with a dangerous potential. I can look at this now, I said, my voice sounding slightly breathless, lacking its usual commanding timbre. If you want to discuss the thesis. I have a few minutes. It was a lie. I had a faculty meeting in 20 minutes, but the thought of letting him walk away now was unbearable. He nodded slowly, a corner of his mouth lifting in a smirk that could have been gratitude or mockery. I was too flustered to tell. Yeah, he said, his voice deep and raspy, vibrating in the quiet room. I'd like that. The simplicity of his response, the lack of academic deference, thrilled me. He wasn't playing the game by the rules, and that made him unpredictable. I gestured towards the side exit that led to the faculty corridors, a private passage away from the prying eyes of the main hallway. My office is just down the hall, I said, gathering my bag. We walked out of the lecture hall together, the heavy door clicking shut behind us. The faculty corridor was dimly lit, lined with portraits of dead deans and distinguished scholars, all white men who stared down at us with disapproval. The sound of our footsteps echoed on the marble floor, the sharp click-clack of my heels competing with the soft thud of his sneakers. I was acutely aware of his presence beside me, his height, the way he occupied space. I felt like I was smuggling something volatile and dangerous into the heart of the ivory tower. We passed closed doors of my colleagues, and I felt a surge of adrenaline at the risk I was taking. When we reached my office, I unlocked the door with a trembling hand, ushering him inside. My office was a sanctuary of books, Persian rugs, and soft lighting, a reflection of my status and taste. He stepped in, looking around with an expression I interpreted as awe, though he said nothing. I followed him in and turned to the door. The decision had been made the moment I invited him. I pushed the heavy oak door closed. The mechanism engaged with a loud, definitive click, a sound that echoed in the small room like a gunshot, sealing us in and the rest of the world out. The apartment I referred to as my studio was located in a pre-war building in the Lower East Side, a neighborhood that still clung to the gritty aesthetic of its past despite the encroaching tide of gentrification. It was a world away from the hermetically sealed glass tower where I lived with Richard, both geographically and spiritually. I had purchased this place 5 years ago under my maiden name, telling myself it was a necessary retreat for writing and research, a space where I could reconnect with the raw, chaotic energy of the city that my academic tenure often shielded me from. The reality, of course, was that it served as a stage set for a version of myself that I had long since outgrown but refused to abandon, the intellectual bohemian, the artist, the woman who lived for ideas rather than equity. The air inside was always heavy with the scent of decaying paper and settled dust, a sharp, dry perfume that I found intoxicating. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the exposed brick walls, crammed with first editions, radical pamphlets from the 1960s, and dog-eared philosophy texts that I hadn't opened since graduate school. Sunlight filtered through the grime of the unwashed windows, dancing in the motes of dust that suspended themselves in the still air like microscopic stars. It was a space of carefully curated neglect, possessing a charm that was meant to feel effortless but was, in truth, as designed as the penthouse uptown. Here, surrounded by the ghosts of old ideas, I felt a different kind of authority, not the institutional power of the university, but something more primal and personal. Marcus sat on the distressed velvet sofa, a piece of furniture I had salvaged from an estate sale in Paris and had shipped over at considerable expense. He looked distinctively out of place, a modern, jarring element in this tableau of vintage academia. His long legs were cramped in the space between the sofa and the low coffee table, and his shoulders were hunched forward, creating a posture of defensive containment. He held the crystal wine glass I had given him by the bowl rather than the stem, his large hand engulfing the delicate vessel. I watched him from across the room as I adjusted the amplifier of the vintage turntable, feeling a surge of affection for his awkwardness. It was a visual confirmation of the distance between us, a gap that I was eager to bridge. I had selected the wine with specific intent. It was a bottle of 1996 Gevrey Chambertin, a Pinot Noir that possessed an earthy, complex character which demanded attention. I knew, with a certainty that bordered on arrogance, that the cost of this single bottle exceeded the entire monthly food budget for the household he grew up in. The calculation didn't make me feel guilty, rather, it added a layer of thrill to the evening. I was not just sharing a drink, I was initiating him into a secret society. I was offering him a taste of the nectar that the gods drank, a flavor profile that was completely alien to the sugary, mass-produced beverages I imagined were the staples of his world. The needle of the record player dropped into the groove, and the room was instantly filled with the smoky, melancholic notes of a saxophone solo. I chose jazz because it was complex, demanding, and historically significant, a genre that required cultural literacy to truly appreciate. I walked over to the sofa and sat down next to him, close enough to feel the radiant heat of his body but maintaining a sliver of propriety. I watched him stare into the dark red liquid, his expression unreadable, perhaps afraid to take a sip and reveal his lack of sophistication. I swirled my own glass gently, releasing the bouquet, and leaned back, letting the music wash over us before I began my instruction. "You have to let it breathe, Marcus," I said softly, my voice dropping to a register that was intimate and instructive. "Wine like this has been trapped in a bottle for longer than you have been alive. It needs oxygen to wake up, to reveal its true face." I watched his profile, the way his eyelashes cast shadows on his cheekbones. I began to lecture him on the subtleties of the palate, explaining the concept of terroir, how the specific geography, the soil, and the climate of a single hillside in France could determine the destiny of the grape. It was a metaphor, of course, for how environment shapes character, a sociological concept wrapped in onology. I spoke about the difference between drinking and tasting, about how the elite use these rituals not just for pleasure, but as a shibboleth, a way to identify their own and exclude outsiders. To navigate the upper echelons of society, I told him, gesturing with my glass, you must understand these codes. You must know how to decipher the language of luxury, or they will always see you as a tourist. I was giving him the keys to the kingdom, teaching him the secret handshakes of the ruling class. I felt generous, benevolent, like a philosopher queen imparting wisdom to a promising subject. But while my mouth spoke of soil composition and tannins, my mind was fixated on something far more visceral. I was obsessed with the texture of his skin, which looked impossibly smooth in the golden afternoon light. I was mesmerized by the contrast between his youth, raw, potential-filled, unwritten, and my own cultivated, finalized experience. He was a blank page, and I held the pen. The intellectual connection I claimed to seek was merely a vehicle for a deeper, darker hunger. I wanted to consume his vitality, to warm my cold, academic hands on the fire of his lived reality. Marcus listened with an intensity that was almost unnerving. His dark eyes tracked every movement of my lips, every gesture of my hands. He didn't interrupt, didn't scoff, didn't look at his phone. He absorbed my words as if they were gospel. When I finally paused, waiting for him to ask a question or offer an observation, he remained silent for a long moment. He took a sip of the wine, finally, wincing slightly at the acidity before swallowing. Then he turned to me, his gaze stripping away the pretense of the lecture. "In my neighborhood," he said, his voice low and devoid of the academic affectation I was trying to instill in him, "we don't drink to taste the soil, Professor. We don't care about the year or the hill. In my world, wine is just a way to turn the volume down. It's a tool to forget, not to remember." His words hung in the air, heavy and brutal, shattering the romantic atmosphere I had constructed. The honesty of it struck me in the chest. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of pity, a deep, wrenching sorrow for the bleakness of the existence he described. But twisted within that pity was a spike of arousal so sharp it made me catch my breath. The tragic narrative he presented was undeniable aphrodisiac. It confirmed his victimhood, his need for rescue, and by extension, my role as the savior. He was damaged, and I was the one with the tools to fix him. The dynamic was intoxicating. I looked at him not as a student, but as a beautiful, broken thing that I had the power to mend. The distance between the professor and the project evaporated, replaced by the magnetic pull between a woman of power and a man of need. I placed my glass on the coffee table with a deliberate click, signaling the end of the lesson and the beginning of something else. I turned my body fully toward him on the sofa. "You don't have to live in that world anymore, Marcus," I whispered, my voice trembling slightly. "I can show you how to turn the volume up. I can show you how to feel everything." I reached out, my hand hovering for a second before touching the collar of his cheap, flannel shirt. "This is crooked," I murmured, a flimsy, transparent excuse that neither of us believed. My fingers brushed against the warm skin of his neck as I straightened the fabric. The contact was electric, grounding me in the physical reality of the moment. He didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned into my touch, his breathing hitching slightly. The air in the room seemed to contract, all the oxygen sucked out by the gravity of the impending collision. I looked into his eyes and saw a mixture of fear and hunger that mirrored my own. The intellectual barriers, the professional ethics, the marital vows, they all dissolved into meaninglessness against the heat of his skin. I leaned in, closing the final inches between us. The kiss was not gentle. It was sharp, urgent, tasting of the expensive wine and the metallic tang of desperation. It was a collision of two worlds. His lips were rougher than I expected, his response hesitant at first, then overwhelming. I felt his hands come up, uncertainly at first, before gripping my waist with a strength that surprised me. He held me as if he were drowning and I was the only solid thing in the ocean. In that moment, with his hands on me and the taste of him in my mouth, I felt a transcendent sense of purpose. I was not just a woman having an affair, I was a goddess descending from Olympus to lay with a mortal. I was gifting him not just my body, but access to a new reality. I was saving him from the grayness of his life, baptizing him in the waters of my affection. The fall from grace was incredibly sweet, a rush of dopamine and adrenaline that made me feel younger, more alive than I had in decades. Every touch felt like an act of charity, a benevolent bestowal of favor for which I was already rewarding myself. I pulled him closer, sinking into the cushions, ready to rewrite his history with my own hands. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was a blinding kaleidoscope of crystal and light, a cavern of opulence that seemed designed to crush the human spirit under the sheer weight of its own magnificence. Thousands of prisms suspended from the gilded ceiling fractured the light into a dizzying array of rainbows that danced across the diamond necklaces and silk lapels of the city's elite. The air was thick with the cloying scent of expensive floral arrangements, white lilies and orchids imported from continents away, mixed with the heavy, musky perfumes of women who had never washed a dish in their lives. It was the university's annual fundraising gala, a spectacle of philanthropy where the wealthy gathered to congratulate themselves on their benevolence while sipping champagne that cost more than a semester's tuition. I stood in the center of this swirling galaxy, a fixed point of elegance in a midnight blue gown that clung to my frame like a second skin, feeling utterly and completely detached from the reality around me. Beside me, Richard was the picture of the distinguished architect, a man who had built skyscrapers and museums, now standing as a monument to his own success. In his bespoke tuxedo, cut with a precision that bordered on mathematical, he looked every inch the partner I was supposed to have. He was currently engaged in a deep, hushed conversation with Dean Sterling, a man whose jowls shook with self-importance as he pontificated about the need for a new wing for the business school. Richard listened with a practiced intensity, nodding at the appropriate intervals, his hand resting possessively but lightly on my elbow. It was a grounding touch, a reminder of my place in this hierarchy, the trophy wife with the PhD, the intellectual accessory that completed his perfect life. I smiled until my facial muscles ached, nodding in rhythm with them, while my mind clawed at the walls of this gilded cage, desperate for a crack in the facade. My gaze drifted away from the dean's flushed face, scanning the room with the clinical detachment of a sociologist observing a particularly strange tribal ritual. I watched the way the donors postured, the subtle displays of dominance in their handshakes, the frantic signaling of status through jewelry and watches. It was a theater of the absurd, a desperate attempt to stave off the irrelevance of mortality with money. And then, through a gap in the crowd, between the black wool of a senator's suit and the red silk of an heiress's dress, I saw him. The breath hitched in my throat, freezing my lungs. Marcus was there. Not as a guest, not as the brilliant student I was nurturing, but as part of the furniture, a ghost in the machine of this extravagant machine. He was wearing the uniform of the catering staff, a stiff, ill-fitting white jacket with gold buttons and black trousers that were slightly too short for his long legs. He held a silver tray laden with flutes of bubbling champagne, navigating the crush of bodies with a rigid, unnatural posture. The university's work-study program required scholarship recipients to give back to the community, a euphemism for providing free labor to the very people who held their futures in their hands. Seeing him like this, reduced to a servant, stripped of his individuality and forced to bow and scrape before the people I despised, sent a shockwave of nausea through me. It was a visceral illustration of the systemic inequality I preached about, played out in high definition right before my eyes. But beneath the indignation, beneath the righteous anger that flared in my chest, there was something else, a dark, twisted coil of arousal that tightened low in my stomach. Seeing him in that uniform, subservient and silent, created a jarring contrast to the raw, intellectual potential I knew he possessed. It was a humiliation, yes, but it was also a display of power dynamics that I found disturbingly intoxicating. I watched a heavy-set donor take a glass from his tray without even looking at him, treating him as an invisible delivery mechanism for alcohol. Marcus's face was a mask of stone, his jaw set so tight I could see the muscle feathering beneath the skin. He was enduring this, suffering this indignity, and I was the only one in the room who truly saw him. I was the only one who knew the fire that burned beneath that stiff white jacket. As if sensing the weight of my gaze, he turned his head. Across the 50 feet of polished parquet floor that separated us, our eyes locked. The noise of the orchestra, a string quartet playing a sanitized version of Mozart, seemed to fade into a dull roar. In his dark eyes, I didn't just see the boredom of a service worker, I read a turbulent mixture of shame, fury, and a desperate, naked plea. He looked like a trapped animal, cornered and stripping his teeth, begging for release. That look pierced through the layers of my social conditioning, shattering the composure I had maintained all evening. He was calling out to me, silently demanding that I acknowledge the bond between us, demanding that I save him from this circus. I could not stay here. The air in the ballroom suddenly felt too thin, the lights too bright, the chatter of the guests too shrill. I needed to be with him. I needed to bridge the gap between the high table and the servants' quarters. I turned to Richard, my hand fluttering to my temple in a gesture of delicate frailty. "Richard," I interrupted, my voice pitched to a perfect note of distress. "I'm sorry, but this migraine. The lights are triggering it terribly. I think I need to find a quiet corner for a moment, perhaps get some water and fresh air." Richard looked down at me, his expression shifting instantly from professional engagement to spousal concern. "Of course, darling," he said, his voice smooth. "Do you want me to come with you? We can call the car." "No, no," I insisted quickly, placing a hand on his chest to stop him. The thought of him hovering over me, suffocating me with his care, was unbearable. "You stay with the dean. This conversation is important for the firm. I just need 10 minutes in the quiet. I'll be fine." He hesitated, torn between his duty to me and his ambition, but ambition won, as I knew it would. He nodded, kissing me lightly on the forehead, a dry, passionless seal of approval. "Take your time," he said. "I'll be right here." I smiled weakly, a masterful performance of the suffering wife, and turned away, slipping through the crowd like a shadow, moving away from the light and towards the edges of the room where the service doors waited. I moved with purpose, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs that had nothing to do with a headache and everything to do with the thrill of the hunt. I skirted the edge of the orchestra pit and found the discreet exit used by the staff. Pushing through the heavy swinging door, the transition was jarring. The lush carpet ended abruptly, replaced by scuffed industrial linoleum. The golden light of the chandeliers gave way to the harsh, buzzing fluorescence of the service corridors. The smell of lilies was replaced by the scent of industrial cleaner, sternos, and the metallic tang of polished silver. I was backstage now, in the guts of the hotel, where the magic was manufactured by invisible hands. I walked down the narrow hallway, the sounds of the party muffled by the thick walls, reduced to a distant, rhythmic thumping. I knew where he would go. We had not spoken, but the geography of our secret was intuitive. Further down the corridor, there was a small alcove, a niche hidden behind a heavy velvet curtain that was used to store extra chairs. It was a pocket of shadow in this bright, exposed world. I slipped behind the heavy fabric, the dust rising in the stagnant air. It was dark, cramped, and quiet. I waited, my back pressed against the cool plaster of the wall, listening to the sound of my own breathing, counting the seconds. A minute later, the curtain rustled. Marcus slipped inside, the movement quick and furtive. In the semi-darkness, the white of his waiter's jacket seemed to glow. He looked wild, his eyes wide, his chest heaving as if he had run a marathon. He ripped the clip-on bow tie from his collar and threw it on the floor with a violent motion. "I can't do this, Eleanor," he hissed, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. "I can't parade around like a monkey in a suit for these people. Did you see them? Did you see how they look at me? Like I'm nothing. Like I'm furniture." He ran a hand over his face, his composure cracking. "I want to leave. I want to walk out those doors and never come back." The rawness of his emotion was palpable, filling the small space with a heat that radiated from his body. The risk of being found here was astronomical. Any manager, any colleague, even Richard could walk by and pull back the curtain. The tension was a physical weight, pressing down on us, sharpening every nerve ending. I reached out, placing my hands on his face, feeling the rough stubble against my palms. "Shoo, Marcus, listen to me," I whispered, my voice fierce and commanding. "You cannot leave. Not yet. You have to play the game to win it. This is the price of admission, don't you see? You are enduring this so you never have to do it again." I stepped closer, pressing my body against his, using my physical presence to ground him. The expensive silk of my gown whispered against the cheap polyester of his trousers. "I am going to get you out of this," I promised, my lips brushing against his ear. "I have already spoken to the department chair about the fellowship in Chicago. And the summer internship at the foundation. I will make sure you get them. I will open the doors, Marcus. But you have to stay. You have to trust me." I was weaving a web of promises, buying his obedience with the currency of my influence, but even as I spoke of grants and careers, my hands were telling a different story. My fingers traced the line of his jaw, then moved down to the open collar of his shirt, touching the hollow of his throat where his pulse beat frantically. The dynamic in the dark alcove shifted. I was no longer just his professor or his mentor, I was his conspirator, his lover, the woman who held the keys to his cage. His anger began to transmute into something else, channeled by my touch. He grabbed my wrists, his grip bruising and desperate. "You promise," he choked out, looking down at me with a vulnerability that shattered me. "You promise this isn't for nothing?" "I promise," I breathed, tilting my head back. "I am doing this for us. For you." The lie tasted sweet on my tongue. I wasn't doing it for him, I was doing it for the feeling of being the architect of a human life. He made a low sound in his throat, a mix of a groan and a sob, and crashed his mouth down onto mine. The kiss was punishing, fueled by the humiliation of the ballroom and the adrenaline of the corridor. It was a reclaiming of power. His hands, rough and seeking, moved over the silk of my dress, no longer hesitant as they had been in the apartment. He bunched the fabric in his fists, pulling me harder against him. We were standing on the precipice of disaster. Just a few feet away, the polite society of the city was drinking champagne, oblivious to the fact that their distinguished professor was pressed against a waiter in a dusty alcove, unraveling. The danger was the ultimate aphrodisiac. Every footstep in the corridor outside made my heart stop and restart with a violent kick. His hand slid down my hip, finding the high slit in my evening gown. His fingers, warm and callous, touched the bare skin of my thigh, moving upward with a possessive urgency. The contrast of his rough hand on my smooth skin, hidden beneath layers of couture, was a secret brand of ownership. "They don't know you," he whispered against my neck, his lips hot and wet. "They think you belong to him. To that man in the tuxedo. But you don't." He bit down gently on the sensitive cord of my neck, leaving a mark that I would have to hide with makeup, a physical testament to his claim. "You're mine, Eleanor. Here in the dark, you're just mine." His words sent a shiver through me that had nothing to do with the cold. It was the thrill of abdication, of surrendering my carefully constructed identity to the chaos he represented. I clung to his shoulders, my nails digging into the fabric of his jacket. The muffled strains of the orchestra playing a waltz drifted through the walls, a surreal soundtrack to our illicit collision. In this cramped, dark space, with the smell of floor wax and sweat, this felt like the only real thing in the entire hotel. The ballroom was the masquerade, this was the truth. I was risking my tenure, my marriage, my reputation, and I didn't care. I wanted him to ruin me. I wanted him to take everything I was and consume it. "Yes," I gasped, as his hand moved higher, shattering the last of my resistance. "I'm yours. Do whatever you want." 3 months had evaporated like mist under the morning sun, a blur of stolen moments and clandestine maneuvering that had completely reshaped the topography of my existence. I felt as though I were standing on the precipice of a new era, a personal renaissance that I had engineered with the same meticulous care I applied to my academic publications. In the bottom drawer of my desk at the university, hidden beneath a stack of graded midterms, lay a thick manila envelope containing the divorce papers. Richard knew nothing yet. He was still living in the comfortable, ignorant bliss of our routine, discussing summer plans for the Hamptons and renovations for the kitchen, unaware that I had already emotionally vacated our marriage. I watched him across the dinner table now with a sense of detached pity, like a scientist observing a species slated for extinction. The guilt I had expected to feel never materialized. It had been entirely displaced by the exhilarating rush of self-actualization. I was not just leaving a husband, I was shedding a skin that had become too tight, too dry, and too old for the vibrant woman I had rediscovered in the arms of my student. The logistics of my departure were complex, but I had managed them with a ruthless efficiency that surprised even me. Just 2 days ago, I had authorized a wire transfer of a substantial sum from my personal inheritance, money that Richard had no legal claim to, into a newly formed charitable trust. Ostensibly, the Urban Potential Initiative was designed to support underprivileged students with exceptional promise, providing them with living stipends and research grants. In reality, the bylaws were written so specifically that there was only one possible beneficiary, Marcus. It was a staggering amount of money, enough to ensure that he would never have to wear a waiter's uniform or live in a basement apartment again. I viewed it not as a gift, but as an investment. I was buying his freedom, clearing the debris from his path so that he could ascend to the heights where I waited for him. It was the final step in his rehabilitation, the golden key that would unlock the cage of his circumstances. Today was the unveiling. The university's annual Student Research Forum was a prestigious event, a showcase where the brightest minds of the next generation presented their work to a global audience of academics, policymakers, and corporate headhunters. The main auditorium, a vast, modern space with acoustic paneling and stadium seating, was packed to capacity. Cameras on boom arms swept over the crowd, broadcasting the event via live stream to thousands of viewers online. The air was thick with the scent of coffee and nervous energy. I sat in the center of the front row, a seat reserved for distinguished faculty, feeling a proprietary thrill hum through my veins. I was not just an observer today, I was the architect of the main event. Marcus had told me weeks ago that his presentation was titled, "The Impact of Mentorship on Social Mobility," and that he had dedicated the entire body of work to me. I checked my reflection in the dark screen of my phone, smoothing a stray hair back into my chignon. I looked radiant, younger than my 45 years. The affair had flushed my skin with color and put a light in my eyes that no amount of expensive serum could replicate. I felt like Pygmalion, the mythical sculptor who had fallen in love with his own creation. I had taken Marcus, a raw, rough-hewn block of potential from the streets, and through my guidance, my body, and my resources, I had chiseled him into a work of art. I had refined his mind, polished his manners, and given him the confidence to stand before this elite crowd as an equal. The pride I felt was overwhelming, a swelling in my chest that made it difficult to breathe. I was eager for the world to see what I had made, to validate the masterpiece that we had created together in the shadows. The lights in the auditorium dimmed, plunging the audience into a hushed anticipation. The dean gave a brief, droning introduction about the importance of diverse voices in academia, but I barely heard him. My eyes were fixed on the heavy velvet curtains at the side of the stage. When the moderator finally announced his name, Marcus Okonjo, a polite ripple of applause moved through the room. I leaned forward, my hands clasped tightly in my lap, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. This was it. This was the moment of metamorphosis. I expected him to walk out in the new blazer I had bought him, perhaps still a little unsure of his footing, looking for me in the crowd for reassurance. I was ready to offer him my encouraging smile, the benevolent gaze of the mentor who had saved him. But when Marcus stepped out from behind the curtain, the breath caught in my throat, freezing into a solid lump of confusion. The figure striding toward the center of the stage was not the boy I knew. Gone were the slouched shoulders and the tentative, defensive gait of the scholarship student who felt out of place. This man moved with a predatory, liquid grace, eating up the space with the confidence of a CEO entering a boardroom he owned. He was wearing a suit, but it wasn't the mid-range department store blazer I had purchased. It was a bespoke Italian cut, charcoal wool that draped perfectly over his frame, tapering at the waist and breaking just right at the shoe. It was the kind of tailoring that cost thousands of dollars, the kind that Richard wore. I blinked, trying to reconcile the image before me with the memory of the boy in the hoodie. His grooming was impeccable. The slightly unkempt hair that I used to run my fingers through was now styled with precision, a sharp, modern cut that accentuated the strong lines of his jaw. On his wrist, catching the glare of the stage lights, was a watch. Even from the front row, I recognized the silhouette of a Patek Philippe. A cold prickle of unease started at the base of my neck. Where had he gotten that? Had he spent the grant money already? But no, the transfer hadn't cleared yet. A Patek was not something you bought with a stipend, it was an heirloom, a signifier of generational wealth. The cognitive dissonance was dizzying. I felt as if the floor beneath my chair had tilted a few degrees, throwing my entire world off balance. He reached the podium, but instead of hiding behind it as most students did, he unclipped the microphone and walked to the edge of the stage. He stood there for a long moment, just looking at the audience. There was no fear in his eyes, no nervousness. There was only a calm, amused arrogance. He scanned the crowd, and for a split second, his gaze locked onto mine in the front row. I expected a wink, a secret signal of our shared intimacy. Instead, his eyes were flat and cold, devoid of the warmth I had grown addicted to. It was like looking into the eyes of a shark. He offered a small, tight smile that didn't reach his eyes, a smile that felt less like a greeting and more like a challenge. Then, he raised the microphone to his lips. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished faculty, and fellow students," he began. The sound of his voice hit me like a physical blow to the chest. The deep, rough timbre I knew, the street-inflected cadence, the dropped consonants of the inner-city dialect, it was all gone. In its place was a crisp, refined baritone, polished to a high sheen. His vowels were rounded and precise, carrying the unmistakable, clipped lilt of the transatlantic elite, perhaps with a hint of a Swiss boarding school education. It was the voice of old money, of international diplomacy, of power. It was a voice that had never had to beg for anything in its life. I sat frozen, my fingernails digging into the leather of my designer handbag, leaving crescent-shaped indentations. My mind was reeling, spinning in a frantic attempt to process the data. Was this a performance? Was this part of the presentation, a demonstration of code switching? I waited for him to break character, to revert to the Marcus I knew, to explain that this was a persona he had adopted to prove a point about assimilation. But he didn't stop. He continued to speak with that terrifyingly perfect diction, commanding the room with an ease that took decades to cultivate. He wasn't acting now. I realized with a sickening jolt that he had been acting before. The boy in the hoodie, the hesitant student, the struggling victim, that was the performance. This stranger on the stage was the reality. Today, I want to talk to you about the narrative of rescue, he continued, pacing slowly across the stage, one hand casually in his pocket. We are told that the university is a place of enlightenment, a mechanism for lifting the downtrodden. But often, the systems designed to help are merely vehicles for the ego of the helper. The audience was captivated. They leaned in, charmed by his eloquence and his dashing appearance. They saw a brilliant young man challenging the status quo. I saw a stranger wearing my lover's face. The disconnect between his words and our history began to scream in my head. He wasn't talking about abstract sociological concepts. He was talking about us. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead, despite the climate-controlled chill of the auditorium. The nausea I had felt at the gala returned, but this time it was sharper, laced with a terrifying clarity. I looked at his hands, the hands that had touched me in the dark, the hands I thought I knew better than my own. They looked different now, confident and expressive, punctuating his points with practiced gestures. I realized I didn't know who this person was. I had invited a complete stranger into my bed, into my life, into the deepest recesses of my psyche. The intimacy we shared, the vulnerability I thought he had shown me, it was all a fabrication. I wasn't the Pygmalion sculpting a statue, I was the statue, molded and manipulated by a master craftsman. We must ask ourselves, Marcus said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that echoed through the state-of-the-art sound system, who is truly benefiting from the charity of the elite? Is it the recipient? Or is it the donor, who purchases moral superiority for the price of a tax write-off? He paused for effect, letting the question hang in the air. The audience nodded thoughtfully, murmuring their agreement. They thought he was critiquing the system. I knew, with a dread that turned my blood to ice, that he was preparing to dismantle me. The text message he had sent me months ago, cold, suddenly took on a new, sinister meaning. It wasn't a complaint about his apartment. It was a description of his heart. I wanted to stand up, to run, to stop him. But my limbs felt heavy, as if filled with lead. I was paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the deception. Every memory of the past 3 months flashed before my eyes, recontextualized by this new reality. His awkwardness with the wine glass, fake. His humiliation at the gala, fake. His awe of my intellect, fake. I had been so blinded by my own arrogance, by my desperate need to be the white savior, that I hadn't seen what was right in front of me. I hadn't seen the shark in the water because I was too busy admiring my own reflection in the surface. He stopped pacing and stood center stage again, the spotlight hitting him directly, creating a halo around his silhouette. He looked magnificent and terrifying. He took a sip of water from the podium, his movements deliberate and slow, building the tension. Then he turned his gaze back to the front row. This time, he didn't just look at me, he looked through me. It was a look of total, devastating dismissal. I would like to present a case study, he said, his polished voice slicing through the silence like a scalpel. A case study in the fetishization of poverty. The screen behind him flickered to life. I stopped breathing. The trap had snapped shut, and I was the one inside the cage. Ladies and gentlemen, Marcus began, his voice reverberating through the hushed auditorium with the weight of a judge passing a final sentence. He paused, letting the silence stretch until it was almost unbearable, a physical tension that tightened the throats of everyone in the room. He turned slowly, deliberately, until his body was angled toward the front row. His eyes, dark and impenetrable as obsidian, locked onto mine. There was no warmth in them, no recognition of the intimacy we had shared, only the cold, clinical detachment of a scientist observing a specimen. Today, I would like to present the findings of a semester-long longitudinal study. I call this project, The White Man's Burden, version 2.0. He spoke the title with a biting, sardonic precision, every syllable a calculated strike against the foundation of my career. The massive projection screen behind him, which was meant to display statistical graphs and sociological models, flickered violently. The university logo vanished, replaced by a jarring, high-contrast image that made my blood run cold. It was not a chart. It was a screenshot of a text message conversation. The bubbles were green and gray, blown up to the size of billboards. I recognized the timestamp immediately. It was from a rainy Tuesday in November. My text read, "I can't stop thinking about your potential. You deserve so much more than this world has given you." And below it, the reply I had received, the one that had made my heart flutter with a savior's pride: "I'm just trying to survive, Professor. You're the only light I see." The words, stripped of their private context and plastered for the world to see, looked grotesque. They didn't look like mentorship, they looked like predation. A collective gasp swept through the auditorium, a sound that sucked the oxygen right out of the room. It was the sound of 3,000 people realizing simultaneously that they were witnessing a public execution. I tried to stand, to shout, to demand that this be stopped, but my body refused to obey. My legs felt like they had been filled with concrete, and my hands were frozen, gripping the arms of my chair so hard that my fingernails were biting into the leather. I was paralyzed, trapped in the amber of my own making. Before the audience could fully process the text messages, the slide changed again. This time, it wasn't static. It was a video. The camera angle was low and slightly angled, likely filmed from a hidden lens in a button or a bag placed on a table. The scene was grainy but unmistakably intimate. It was my apartment, the studio, in the Lower East Side. The audio was crystal clear, amplified by the state-of-the-art sound system of the lecture hall. My voice filled the room, breathless and condescendingly sweet. "You have to let it breathe, Marcus. Wine like this has been trapped in a bottle for longer than you have been alive." The audience watched in horrified fascination as the on-screen Eleanor, looking like a caricature of elitism, guided the hands of the poor student around a crystal goblet. The juxtaposition of my pedantic lecture on tannins with the obvious sexual undercurrent of the scene was nauseating. It stripped away the intellectual veneer I had carefully constructed, revealing the raw, ugly power dynamic beneath. Marcus turned back to the audience, gesturing casually at the screen where my humiliation was playing on a loop. "My father," he said, his voice smooth and conversational, "owns the largest telecommunications conglomerate in West Africa. He sits on the board of 3 international banks. We have a family estate in Lagos that makes this university's campus look like a strip mall." He laughed, a short, sharp sound that echoed in the stunned silence. "I grew up spending my summers in Ghetto and my winters in Dubai. I speak 4 languages fluently, and I have been drinking vintage Burgundy since I was 12 years old." The revelation hit the room like a physical shockwave. The narrative of the struggling, inner-city youth, the narrative I had fallen in love with, vaporized instantly. "But," Marcus continued, pacing the stage with the easy confidence of a man who owns the ground he walks on, "my father always warned me about the West. He told me that Western liberalism is often a mask for a deep-seated superiority complex. He said that people here love the idea of diversity, provided it comes in a package they can pity and control." He stopped pacing and looked directly at the camera streaming the event to the internet. I didn't believe him. I thought he was cynical. So, when I was accepted here, I decided to test his hypothesis. I created a character. I bought the hoodie at a thrift store. I adopted the accent from movies. And I waited to see who would try to save me. He pointed a finger at me, a gesture that felt like a spear through my chest. Professor Eleanor Vance didn't see a student. She didn't see a man. She saw a prop. She saw an accessory for her own virtue. His voice rose, filled with a righteous, burning sarcasm. She needed me to be poor. She needed me to be broken. Because if I wasn't broken, what use was she? She constructed an entire biography for me in her head, the struggling victim from the ghetto, and projected it onto me without ever asking a single real question about my life. She was so in love with her own reflection as that great white hope, that she never noticed I was wearing a watch that costs more than her car. On the screen, the video changed again. This time, it was footage from the gala. It showed me in the alcove, pressing him against the wall, my hands sliding under his jacket. The audio picked up my whisper, "I will open the doors, Marcus. But you have to stay." The transactional nature of the moment was laid bare. It wasn't romance, it was coercion. It was the purchase of affection using institutional power as currency. The audience was no longer gasping, they were murmuring, a low, ugly sound of judgment and titillation. I could feel the heat rising in my face, a burning shame that felt like it was searing the skin off my bones. I wanted to disappear, to dissolve into the floor, but the spotlight of the stage spilled over onto the front row, illuminating me in my misery. "This," Marcus said, sweeping his arm toward the screen where a montage of my mentorship was playing, "is the reality of the savior complex. It is not about helping the marginalized. It is about consuming them. It is about the thrill of ownership." He paused, letting the words sink in. I was never a person to her. I was a pet. A dangerous, exotic pet that she could keep in a secret apartment and feed treats to, feeling good about her own benevolence. The cruelty of his words was matched only by their precision. He was dissecting my soul with a scalpel, exposing the rot I had refused to acknowledge even to myself. To the right of the main video feed, a sidebar appeared on the screen. It was the live comment feed from the university's streaming platform. The text scrolled by at a dizzying speed, a waterfall of digital judgment. "OMG, she is finished," wrote one user. Another posted a string of crying laughing emojis followed by a vomiting face. "Talk about an power trip," read another. "Wait, is that her husband in the background of the gala video?" The internet had arrived, and it was hungry. I realized with a sick clarity that this wasn't just a campus scandal. This was viral. My name, my face, my career, it was all being ground into digital dust in real time, broadcast to millions of screens around the world. I looked around the room, desperate for a friendly face, for someone who would stand up and stop this nightmare. But all I saw were phones. Hundreds of them, held up like candles at a vigil, recording my destruction. My colleagues, people I had shared tenure committees with, were staring at me with expressions ranging from horror to schadenfreude. Dean Sterling, seated 3 chairs away, was furiously typing on his BlackBerry, undoubtedly drafting the press release that would announce my immediate suspension. Even the students, the ones who had hung on my every word about social justice, looked at me with disgust. I had become the very monster I taught them to hate. "I have one final piece of data to share," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a lower, more intimate register. The screen went black for a second, then displayed a single email. It was the confirmation of the wire transfer I had initiated for the trust fund. The amount was highlighted in neon yellow, $250,000. "She tried to buy me," Marcus said simply. "She thought she could purchase my gratitude, my future, and my silence. She liquidated her assets to create a golden cage for a bird that was already free." He shook his head, looking at me with a pity that was far worse than his anger. "It is pathetic." He walked to the edge of the stage, looming over me. From this angle, he looked like a titan, and I was small, insignificant, a bug pinned to a board. "You wanted to teach me about power, Professor?" he asked softly, but the microphone carried his voice to every corner of the room. "You wanted to show me how the world works? Consider this my final paper." He smiled, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of the boy I thought I loved, but it was twisted into a cruel parody. "You get an F for ethics, but an A+ for providing excellent research material." "Thank you, Professor Vance," he announced, straightening up and addressing the crowd one last time. "Thank you for being the perfect laboratory rat. Your participation in this experiment has been invaluable." He bowed deeply, a theatrical gesture that mocked the solemnity of the academic setting. The auditorium erupted, not in outrage, but in applause. It started as a smattering of claps from the back, likely the students who enjoyed chaos, and then it grew. It was the applause of a Colosseum crowd that had just watched a gladiator strike the killing blow. They were cheering for the spectacle, for the brutality of the takedown. Marcus turned on his heel and walked toward the wings of the stage. He moved with that same athletic, confident stride I had admired just minutes ago. He didn't look back. He didn't hesitate. He simply exited the narrative he had hijacked, leaving the wreckage behind him. I sat alone in the front row as the house lights came up, blindingly bright, white and unforgiving. They washed out the shadows, leaving me nowhere to hide. I was an empty shell, hollowed out and discarded, sitting in the debris of a life that had been dismantled in 20 minutes. The applause began to fade into the buzz of excited conversation, the sound of 1,000 people rushing to tweet, to post, to share the news of my ruin. I stared at the empty stage, at the blank screen, and realized that for the first time in my life, I was truly, completely seen, and there was nothing left to save.